In this episode, we're going to connect everyday security best practices to the very specific goal of being ready when a cyber incident happens. Beginners sometimes treat best practices like a moral checklist, where you either follow them or you don't, but incident readiness is a strategy problem, not a purity test. The real question is how each practice changes what happens on your worst day. When something breaks, people are worried, and decisions need to be made quickly. If a best practice makes the incident smaller, makes it easier to understand, or makes recovery faster, it is doing incident readiness work. If it exists only on paper and doesn't change outcomes under stress, it's not helping much. By the end, you should be able to hear a practice like patching or logging and immediately connect it to containment, evidence, communication, and recovery. A useful starting point is the basic security goal that sits behind almost every best practice: protecting confidentiality, integrity, availability, CIA. Confidentiality is about keeping information from being seen by people who should not see it. Integrity is about keeping information and systems from being changed in unauthorized or unexpected ways. And availability is about keeping systems and services usable when they are needed. Incident readiness improves when you can quickly see which part of CIA is under threat, because that helps you decide priorities without panic. If confidentiality is threatened, you may need to control data movement and involve stakeholders who manage disclosure risk. If integrity is threatened, you may need to focus on trust and verification, because a system that is up but untrustworthy can be worse than a system that is down. If availability is threatened, you may need to coordinate recovery and continuity so the organization can keep functioning while security work continues. One of the most strategic best practices is knowing what you actually have, because you cannot protect or restore what you cannot identify. Asset visibility means having a reliable understanding of your systems, devices, accounts, applications, and data stores, along with who owns them and what they are used for. In an incident, that visibility becomes the difference between targeted response and wild guessing, because you need to answer questions like which systems are affected, which ones are critical, and which ones can be isolated without breaking the business. Asset visibility also makes communication easier, because you can describe impact in concrete terms instead of vague statements. For a beginner, the key idea is that inventory is not busy work, it is your map, and incidents are much harder to manage when you are missing the map. When you practice incident readiness, you are building the habit of knowing your environment well enough to act without improvising basic facts. A second strategic best practice is reducing the blast radius, which means limiting how much damage any single compromise can cause. The concept of least privilege is a great example, because it aims to give people and systems only the access they truly need. When least privilege is applied well, a stolen account often cannot reach everything, and a compromised system often cannot move freely across the environment. That directly changes incident response goals, because containment can be smaller and faster when the attacker's pathways are limited. Segmentation is related, because it is about separating systems into zones so that one problem does not automatically become everyone's problem. Even in plain terms, you can think of it like closed doors inside a building, where you still have hallways and rooms, but a fire in one room does not immediately spread to every other room. If you want a readiness mindset, you ask which doors should already be closed before the incident begins. Patch and vulnerability management is another best practice that looks like routine maintenance, but it has huge incident readiness value. Many incidents begin with a known weakness, and once an attacker gets in through an old gap, the organization often spins the incident wishing that gap had been closed earlier. The strategic point is not that you must patch everything instantly, because real organizations have constraints, but that you need a disciplined way to prioritize and to reduce the most likely and most damaging paths. When patching is organized, it reduces the number of ways an attacker can enter, and it reduces the number of ways they can regain access after you contain them. It also strengthens your confidence during response, because you can rule out certain causes if you know specific fixes were applied. For beginners, the takeaway is that patching is not about being perfect, it is about shrinking the attack surface in a measured way that makes incidents less frequent and less severe. Secure configuration is a best practice that supports incident readiness by reducing accidental complexity and predictable weaknesses. Many systems arrive with default settings that are convenient but risky, such as unnecessary services, broad permissions, or weak logging. Hardening is the general term for tightening configurations so that systems do only what they need to do and expose as little as possible. When you harden systems, you make it harder for attackers to find easy wins, and you also make your environment more consistent, which helps during response. Consistency matters because incidents are confusing, and inconsistent systems create extra confusion, such as different logs in different places or different access rules that nobody can explain quickly. A hardened, standardized environment also speeds recovery because you can rebuild or restore to known good settings rather than guessing what the system should look like. In plain terms, secure configuration is about making normal operations clean and predictable so abnormal behavior stands out. Identity and access practices are a major pillar of readiness because many incidents revolve around accounts, credentials, and permissions. Multi-Factor Authentication, MFA, is important here because it makes it harder for a stolen password alone to become full access. That changes incident outcomes because a credential theft event might stay smaller, and it can give you more time to respond before damage occurs. Good access practices also include account lifecycle discipline, such as removing access when it is no longer needed and separating administrative actions from everyday work. From an incident leadership perspective, identity practices matter because they give you strong containment levers, like disabling a compromised account, forcing resets, or tightening access paths during response. They also reduce uncertainty because you can more confidently interpret unusual access patterns when normal access is well controlled. When the exam asks about preparation, identity is often a quiet but central theme because it touches both prevention and response. Logging and monitoring are best practices that directly support the moment when you are trying to turn confusion into facts. Logs are records of events, and good logging means you have the information needed to answer what happened, when it happened, and how far it reached. Monitoring is the practice of watching those events and patterns so unusual behavior becomes visible rather than hidden. This is strategic because many incidents are not discovered instantly, and the first hours often involve building a timeline, validating claims, and figuring out scope. If you lack logs or your logs are unreliable, your incident becomes an argument based on assumptions rather than a response based on evidence. Good logging also supports accountability and learning, because after the incident you can examine what worked, what failed, and what signals were missed. For a beginner, the important connection is that logging is not just for detection, it is for decision-making, because leaders need evidence to choose actions responsibly. Backups and recovery planning are best practices that define whether an incident becomes a temporary disruption or a long-term crisis. A backup is only useful if it can be restored and trusted, which means you need to know that it exists, that it is complete enough for your needs, and that it has not been corrupted or compromised. Recovery planning is about knowing what to restore first, how to validate what you restore, and how to keep the organization running while restoration happens. This becomes especially important in destructive incidents where systems are unavailable or data is damaged, because the ability to restore quickly can reduce business impact dramatically. From an incident leadership viewpoint, backups are also a negotiation tool, because they give you alternatives, and alternatives reduce panic. If you know you can restore, you can make better containment decisions and avoid risky shortcuts. If you cannot restore, you may feel pressured to keep compromised systems running, which increases long-term risk. Preparation is also about people and process, not just technology, and best practices include having clear plans, roles, and decision paths. An incident response plan is a shared agreement on how the organization will recognize incidents, who gets involved, how decisions are made, and how communication will work. The strategic value is that plans reduce delay and disagreement, because you do not want to invent authority and escalation during the crisis itself. Playbooks are more focused guidance for common incident types, which helps teams move faster without guessing the next step. Pre-approved decisions matter because some actions require authority or carry business impact, and waiting for approval can increase harm. For beginners, it helps to see that a plan is not a binder. It is a set of expectations that shapes behavior when stress is high. The exam often rewards answers that show you understand that readiness is built before the incident, not during it. Communication best practices are a surprisingly strong part of incident readiness because poor communication can amplify damage even when technical response is good. Readiness includes knowing who needs to be informed, what kinds of updates they need, and how to avoid contradictory messages. It also includes knowing when not to communicate publicly until facts are confirmed and approvals are in place, because premature statements can create legal and reputational harm. Internally, communication best practices include keeping status accurate, using consistent terminology, and ensuring handoffs between teams do not drop critical details. This connects to incident tracking, because tracking gives you a reliable source of truth for what has been done and what remains. In a crisis, rumors fill empty space, so clear communication reduces chaos by replacing rumor with controlled facts. When you think strategically, you treat communication as a protective control, not as a public relations afterthought. Training and exercises are best practices that create readiness by building muscle memory in a safe environment. People make different choices under pressure than they do when calm, and the only way to learn how your team behaves in an incident is to practice. Practice is not about pretending to be perfect. It is about discovering gaps, like unclear roles, missing contact paths, or slow decision approvals. Exercises also teach people what good documentation and tracking look like, because those habits can feel unnatural until they are repeated. For beginners, the key is that training converts written plans into lived habits, and lived habits are what appear during real incidents. Readiness is not only knowledge of what should happen, but confidence in what will happen because you have seen it work. When the exam tests incident leadership, it often assumes you understand that practice reduces error and reduces recovery time. Another strategic best practice is building resilience into dependencies, because incidents often involve third parties, shared services, and interconnected systems. Supply chain risk is the idea that your organization can be affected by weaknesses in vendors, software components, or partners you rely on. From a readiness perspective, this means knowing what external services are critical, what your fallback options are, and how you would respond if a dependency fails or is compromised. It also means having clear contracts and expectations around notification, support, and shared responsibilities during an incident. A beginner does not need to become a contract expert to understand the principle that dependencies expand your risk and can complicate response. If you cannot quickly identify which services are external and who owns those relationships, you may waste time during a crisis trying to find the right contacts. Strategic preparation includes knowing where you are dependent and having a plan for how to respond when that dependency becomes the problem. Finally, it's important to understand that best practices become strategic when they are measured and maintained, not when they are announced once. A control that exists but is not monitored can silently decay, like a backup process that runs but produces unusable backups, or logging that exists but is missing key systems. Readiness improves when you track whether controls are actually working, using simple indicators like coverage, timeliness, and consistency. You do not need complex metrics to get value. You need enough measurement to detect drift and to justify improvement decisions. Maintenance is part of readiness because the environment changes constantly, with new systems, new accounts, and new risks, and yesterday's good practice can become today's gap. When leaders treat best practices as living habits rather than one-time projects, incidents become more manageable over time. That mindset also helps you answer exam questions because it aligns with disciplined, sustainable security leadership. To close, applying security best practices strategically means constantly asking how each practice changes incident outcomes in real terms. Asset visibility improves your ability to scope and communicate. Least privilege and segmentation shrink the blast radius. Patching and hardening reduce easy entry points. Identity controls give you strong containment levers, and logging provides the evidence needed for confident decisions. Backups and recovery planning determine whether you can restore services without gambling, while plans, training, and communication discipline keep people aligned when stress is high. Even supply chain awareness and simple measurement practices matter because real incidents often involve dependencies and control drift. When you connect every best practice to the incident phases of preparation, detection, containment, recovery, and learning, the practices stop being generic advice and become a readiness strategy. That is the kind of thinking an incident leader needs, and it is exactly what this certification expects you to demonstrate.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.